The night sky burned red as hundreds watched in disbelief, their eyes glued to screens, their hearts racing faster than the missiles flying across the Middle East. It wasn't just an attack, it was a declaration, a moment that rewrote the balance of fear. On that unforgettable night, Iran didn't just launch missiles, it launched a message to the world: the era of silent humiliation was over, and the lion had finally roared back. Israel, known for its iron shield and unmatched intelligence, had just suffered a blow not in numbers, but in pride. And as the dust settled and the silence of the intercommunal community grew louder, the world began to understand it wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about power, defiance, and a history of wounds that had finally erupted. This wasn't a war of borders. It was a war of narratives, a war that had been simmering for decades beneath diplomatic smiles and fragile peace talks. For years, Israel projected dominance. Its intelligence agencies feared its military unmatched, its alliances ironclad. All of that was cracked open in a single night when Iran decided to break the unspoken rules. The operation was calculated, surgical, and deeply psychological. It began with drone swarms, small quiet engines, and they penetrated Israeli airspace before the Iron Dome could even compute their patterns. These weren't just consumer drones, they were military-grade spectres programmed to confuse and overwhelm. The Iron Dome fired. Missiles screamed into the air, but for every drone destroyed, 2 made it through. Then came the ballistic missiles, heavier, faster, packed with payloads designed to shock, not necessarily to kill. Iran wasn't trying to wipe out cities, trying to humiliate, and it succeeded. Key military installations were struck. A covert Mossad site near Tel Aviv saw its walls breached. An airbase in the Negev was partially crippled. And in one of the most symbolically painful blows, and an Israeli surveillance satellite ground station went dark. The images spread like wildfire, smoke rising from what was once considered impenetrable. Videos of Israeli citizens scrambling into bunkers while sirens wailed across the night. Social media exploded, not with rage, but with questions. How? How did this happen? Where was the intelligence? Where was the defense? And most haunting of all, why wasn't the world reacting? Because this wasn't just about military tactics. It was about silence. Deafening, deliberate silence from global powers. The United States issued a statement urging calm on all sides. Europe, split between its economic interests and diplomatic weakness, offered vague condemnations and calls for de-escalation. The UN met for an emergency session but produced nothing but empty rhetoric. Russia and China watched with cold, calculating eyes, recognizing the shift. Iran had done what no one expected. It called Israel's bluff and exposed the limits of Western support. To understand the weight of that night, we must travel back, decades back, to 1953, when Iran's elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup backed by the CIA and MI6. It was the beginning of a long, brutal history of foreign interference, sanctions, and containment. Then came the 1979 revolution, a line in the sand. Iran declared itself sovereign, Islamic, and anti-West. It became the thorn in the side of American foreign policy, and by extension, Israel's fiercest regional opponent. In the shadows, they fought countless wars: cyber wars, proxy wars, assassinations, nuclear sabotage, scientists mysteriously killed, facilities mysteriously blown up, but through it all, Iran endured, bruised but not broken, sanctioned but not silent. And with each passing decade, it grew smarter, more resilient, and more dangerous. And Israel, it continued to dominate the narrative. Its enemies were portrayed as terrorists, its strikes as preemptive, its intelligence operations as necessary. But pride, when unchecked, breeds blind spots. And that night, Iran found one, and it didn't hesitate. The world watched, waiting for Israel to respond. Retaliation was expected. Another Gaza-level bombardment, a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. Something, but Israel hesitated, not because it couldn't strike, but because the consequences of escalation were suddenly too high. Iran had made it clear next time it wouldn't stop it at symbolic targets. Instead of strength, the world saw Israel's hesitation, and to the silent observers across the globe, from Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia, that hesitation was louder than any missile. It meant that power had shifted, that the old world order, where the West held the leash, was breaking apart. Iran's allies, like Hezbollah and the Houthis, celebrated, not with parades, but with readiness, saw the blueprint. They saw that Israel could bleed, that Western silence was possible, that fear could be exported, and they began preparing. Meanwhile, inside Israel, public anger grew, not just at Iran, but at their own government. How could such a sophisticated nation be caught off guard? How deep had the pride gone that no one saw it coming? Social unrest brewed. Protests erupted, not against Iran, but against a leadership that promised invincibility and delivered vulnerability. And in Washington, panic. The US long guaranteed Israel's edge. Billions in military aid, intelligence sharing, vetoes at the UN. But now, with wars in Ukraine, tensions in Taiwan, and internal division, the ability to shield Israel had limits. And Iran had found them. But Iran wasn't finished. In the days following the strike, Iranian state media aired footage of missile manufacturing sites, of underground silos, of drone swarms in training. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Not boasting. Warning, we can do it again, the message said. And next time, we won't stop at symbols. In diplomatic circles, a cold realization settled in Iran had changed the rules. It didn't need nukes to challenge Israel. It didn't need to win a war. It only needed to show that it was no longer afraid and that it could strike the unstrikable. And still, the world stayed silent. The silence was not ignorance. It was strategy. No one wanted to choose sides in a war that could engulf the region. Saudi Arabia, fresh from new diplomatic ties with Tehran, offered mediation. Turkey called for regional unity. Egypt, quiet but attentive, began quietly shifting military assets. Everyone understood the same thing: a new chapter had begun. And the question on every nation's mind wasn't, will Iran strike again? As the ash settled and the headlines faded, another war was just beginning, one of perception. And in that battlefield, Iran was winning. The world had grown used to seeing Tehran as the pariah state boxed in by sanctions, diplomatically isolated and militarily cautious. But the night Iran struck, that image shattered. Suddenly, Iran was not the isolated underdog. It was the nation that had to strike there to the heart of Israel and survive the consequences. In Tehran, the streets were filled with defiant chants and celebrations. These weren't the wild cheers of a reckless nation. They were the calculated reactions of a people long suppressed and finally tasting psychological victory. Iran hadn't just hit Israel's infrastructure, it had hit the narrative, the illusion of untouchability. And it had done so with precision, planning, and a level of patience that unnerved even the West's sharpest military minds. But the strike was more than a message to Israel. It was a challenge to the international community, a signal to the global South, to the non-aligned nations, to those long bullied by Western double standards. The silence that followed the attack wasn't just cowardice. It was an echo of a world slowly fracturing along new lines. Lines not drawn by NATO or the UN, but by the raw, unfiltered emergence of multipolar defiance. Inside Israel, the shockwave wasn't limited to politics or the military. It ran deeper, touched the very identity of a nation built on survival, deterrence, and strength. Israel's doctrine had always been clear: strike first, strike hard, and never show weakness. But now weakness had been exposed not in battlefield losses, but in the mere fact that Iran had crossed a line few believed it ever would. And that weakness had consequences. Iran's regional allies, once limited to proxy wars and guerrilla tactics, suddenly felt empowered. Hezbollah in Lebanon began deploying more openly along the border. The Houthis, who had already stunned the world by targeting Israeli-linked ships in the Red Sea, now spoke with a confidence that terrified Gulf states. Even Syria, ravaged by years of war, whispered new ambitions under Iran's protective shadow. The unthinkable was happening. A new coalition was forming, not through official pacts or summit meetings, but through shared defiance and a common enemy. It was the birth of a new Middle East axis, one that no longer feared Western wrath or Israeli retaliation. And Israel knew it. Tel Aviv's intelligence community launched a full-scale internal review. How had this happened? Who had failed? The reported to a combination of arrogance and assumption. Iran's slow, calculated buildup had been dismissed. Their drones were underestimated, their missile capabilities downplayed, and their strategic mind, the one that dared to strike without immediately escalating to full-scale war, had been overlooked entirely. The Mossad chief was summoned. The IDF command was overhauled. Yet the deeper issue couldn't be solved with resignations or policy shifts. It was psychological. The people of Israel, long confident in the power of their defense systems, began to doubt. If Iran could hit once, it could hit again. And next time, what if the targets weren't strategic, civilian? That fear boiled into every layer of society. Real estate prices near the Gaza border plummeted. Military enlistment inquiries dropped. And in private homes and cafes, for the first time in a generation, Israelis began whispering questions once considered taboo: what if we're not as safe as we thought? But while Israel reeled, Iran remained composed. There was no second strike, no inflammatory speeches, no gloating. That was the genius of it. The restraint spoke louder than aggression. It wasn't a reckless lashing out. It was a demonstration of discipline, of knowing exactly how far to push without crossing into uncontrollable war. Global media tried to spin it. Some called it a provocation, others a justified retaliation for years of Israeli sabotage inside Iran. But no matter the framing, one fact remained unchallenging: Iran had acted and the world had watched. And it wasn't just Israel watching. Saudi Arabia, long a quiet ally of Israel under the table, felt the tremor too. Their recent diplomatic warming with Iran had come not from trust, but necessity. Now, they realized just how necessary the detente had been. Qatar and the UAE, balancing between Western alliances and regional realities, began shifting their tone. Iran was no longer just a regional nuisance. It was a central player that had to be engaged, respected, and above all, not underestimated. Meanwhile, in Washington, internal divisions exploded. Some urged immediate military support to Israel. Others, especially within intelligence circles, warned against escalation. Iran's missile strike had shown not just capability, but a willingness to absorb consequences. A direct US retaliation dragged the entire region into chaos, destabilizing oil markets, pushing inflation, and possibly triggering global war. And so the silence remained. Not all silence is passive. In the darkness, Iran was moving. Satellite images revealed rapid construction around Iranian missile bases. Drone testing intensified. Cyber activity targeting Israeli systems surged. But it was all beneath the radar, all just shy of provocation. Iran wasn't preparing for another strike. It was preparing for deterrence. In effect, Tehran had rewritten the rulebook. It had forced the world to treat it not as a rogue actor, as a sovereign force capable of strategic warfare. And in doing so, it had flipped the long-standing narrative. No longer was Israel the region's only power with red lines. Iran had drawn its own and crossed one just to show it could. And yet the world still stayed silent, not out of respect, but out of recognition. The global balance was changing, that a multipolar world was no longer theory, but reality, that a nation long punished, sanctioned, and isolated could still bend the arc of history with one night of boldness. And as the months rolled on, a new crisis emerged elsewhere. The memory of that night remained, not in headlines or textbooks, but in the quiet recalculations of every foreign policy advisor, every intelligence operative, every defense strategist. Because that night, the myth of invincibility died, and the silence that followed, it wasn't peace, it was fear. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that night refused to fade, not in the corridors of the Pentagon, nor in the silent war rooms of Tel Aviv, nor even in the ancient streets of Qom, where Iran's clerics watched the world shift with patient eyes. For decades, war between Iran and Israel had been a specter, an unspoken threat, a balance of shadows. But the moment Iran struck, it became real, tangible, measurable, and it changed the calculations of everyone involved. Inside Israel, the political fractures widened. The ruling coalition came under immense pressure. Opposition leaders seized on the attack to question every layer of governance. How could Iran have coordinated such a sophisticated assault under the nose of the region's most powerful surveillance state? How had the legendary Mossad missed it? For a country used to intelligence dominance, the failure was personal. And it wasn't just about the military. The attack struck at the heart of Israel's psychological armor. For the first time in recent memory, Israelis felt genuinely vulnerable, not just to rocket attacks from Gaza, but to long-range, high-tech strikes from a powerful adversary. The Iron Dome, while still functional, had shown its limits. Confidence turned into anxiety, and that anxiety spilled into every corner of society. But if Israel was shaken, Iran was resolute. Iranian media refrained from gloating. Their officials spoke not in fiery chants, but in cold, measured tones. They portrayed the strike as a response, not an escalation, a reaction to years of Israeli sabotage, assassinations, and airstrikes on Iranian interests. And the international silence that followed, Tehran interpreted it as validation, a silent nod from the world that it had the right to defend itself, even if no one dared to say it out loud. Behind closed doors, Iran's allies grew bolder. In Beirut, Hezbollah expanded its arsenal. In Yemen, the Houthis increased their drone production, buoyed by Iranian advisors and new technology. In Syria, militias once on the defensive now took initiative, emboldened by the belief that Israeli retaliation was no longer inevitable. And in Iraq, whispers grew louder, whispers of Iranian-backed groups ready to challenge, just you guess, presence but Israeli assets in the region. But Iran wasn't merely building alliances, it was sending signals, calculated acts to reinforce its message without triggering a full-scale war, a drone overflight near Eilat, a cyber attack on an Israeli water system, a leaked video of missile stockpiles deep beneath Iranian mountains. Tehran was crafting an image of strategic deterrence, an image that said we don't want war, but we are ready for it, and Israel had to respond. In private, its military command drafted plans. Retaliation options were considering airstrikes on missile sites, cyber sabotage, targeted killings. But each option carried risk. Iran had made it clear. Any Israeli strike would be met with overwhelming retaliation, not just from Tehran, but from all directions. A regional war wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. And so, Israel found itself in unfamiliar territory restrained. This restraint didn't go unnoticed. Across the Arab world, public opinion began to shift. Once Iran was seen as a sheer threat or an unpredictable radical state, it now appeared as the only regional power willing to stand up to Israeli dominance and survive. In the cafes of Cairo, the mosques of Amman, and the marketplaces of Baghdad, the story spread Iran had hit Israel, and Israel didn't hit back. The narrative, tightly controlled by Western media, was now in the hands of millions online. Videos of the strike, analysis of satellite damage, the confused expressions of Israeli anchors, the silence of Washington. It all created a mosaic of doubt. Doubt in the invincibility of Israel and in the unshakable power of the United States. That doubt had consequences. In Washington, policy hawks panicked. Sanctions on Iran were reviewed, military options discussed. But the Biden administration, already strained by Ukraine and domestic unrest, knew that opening another front in the Middle East would be suicidal. Iran had done the unthinkable, not just by striking Israel, by doing so in a moment where the US could not afford to respond. And so statements were made, sanctions reinforced, but no real action followed. And the silence continued. This emboldened not just Iran, but others. China began quietly supporting Iran's diplomatic overtures. Russia increased military coordination with Tehran in Syria. Even Turkey, once a bitter rival of Iran, reopened secret channels of cooperation. A new regional order was forming, and it was one where Israel, for the first time in decades, was not at the center of gravity. But Iran knew that one strike was not enough to change the world. It needed to follow up with diplomacy, with influence, with presence. And so it launched a new initiative, what it called the Axis of Resistance Summit. Leaders and representatives from Syria, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and even Palestinian factions gathered in Tehran. The message was clear: resistance was no longer a fringe effort. It was a coalition. Israel watched, frustrated. Its intelligence picked up on weapons transfers, coordinated strategy sessions, and logistical frameworks that mirrored NATO-like integration. It couldn't strike, not without reigniting the storm it had barely weathered, and so focused inward. Defense budgets soared. Military drills intensified. The cyber division doubled in size, but the public's mood remained cautious. The wound was psychological. A nation once known for its unshakable confidence was now watching its skies, wondering not if, but when the next strike would come. And still, the world said nothing. The UN held briefings. The EU offered to mediate, but no one dared to blame Iran directly. And no one offered Israel the green light it so desperately sought. The silence, shocking, became normal. And that normalization, that quiet acceptance of a new balance, is what terrified Israel the most. Because the world had not only watched the night Iran struck, it had accepted it. And in the Middle East, acceptance is the beginning of real power.